Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Beit Midrash. Hope everyone's doing well, feeling good, enjoying spring break. For those who still get spring break, I don't know. Do we still get spring break? Um, but glad you're here and glad you're joining us today, as I will continue today in uh, in our book on God of Becoming in Relationship by Rabbi Artson, on chapter 13 on Israel and the diaspora and the embrace of Israel and the diaspora. So, before we jump in, any preliminary thoughts, comments, questions?
Rabbi, I want to say something because I rarely speak, and that is this chapter spoke to me very
Excellent.
specifically, and I'm grateful for it.
Well, we're
I,
grateful
I like
for that as well.
particularly the sentence taken from Jeremiah: "Do not, seek the welfare of the city to which I will exile you, and pray for the Holy One on its behalf. For its prosperity you shall prosper." Yeah. And then that I think it was the final sentence.
Yes. Um, our custom during the service of praying for offering the prayer for our country. The text doesn't come, but the idea of doing so comes from Jeremiah and from this section where he says, pray for the welfare of where you are because that's where you are. So you're going to, if the better it does, the better you will do.
It speaks to me strongly because it became a family's tradition. You go to college and you bring it home. You go to college and you bring it home. And it was my immigrant grandfather, whom I never knew, a great grandfather, who said, let's see, what was that going to bring from Lithuania? I can't remember what I was going to say, but it's a family tradition. And both of my children came back, and now they're circling like lost planets where they're actually going to sit it down.
Yes, Barbara.
Very much in line with what Ellen just said about home. Rabbi Artson does go ahead and he says, everywhere we are is home. Home is wherever your feet are. And even without thinking of it in this context, we do that. How many times have you been out? You're somewhere different. You're staying in a hotel. You're staying somewhere, and it's whenever you're ready to do something else. Go home, take a shower. I just said it myself. We always say, okay, let's go home and have dinner. Let's this and we say home. So even if we're not thinking of it in this context, we know wherever we are is a home, whether it's temporary or not. I'm ready to make my complaint about the book, though, about the chapter.
Okay.
He didn't screw up the science too much this time, but he got the geology wrong.
Whoops.
You want to be more specific?
Page 113, middle of the page, he's talking about, are the continents permanent? Yeah. Well, maybe on a human scale, but I beg to differ with that, because every time you see a rock fall, I mean, there are processes going on all the time that makes it look like it's not permanent to you, to me, to whatever. And then he continues on and he's talking about how the earth is churning and moving. And I don't have a problem with that. But geologically speaking, the earth is a viscous, roiling liquid. Nah, it's not. But changes, I'll accept. He's just getting a little too flowery in his language. But
yeah, I mean, look, I think the core of what he's saying, the details may not be 100% accurate, but The continents as we know them now were not always where they were now.
And they weren't the same shape.
Correct.
But that doesn't mean that they're liquid. That doesn't mean that they are, even on a geologic time scale, they're not.
Again, that's what I'm saying. Like, I think the details might not be 100% accurate, but I think the general thought of where he's going of, we sometimes like to think this is the way it's always been, but it's not. You look at the broad scope of our world's history, and it's not.
Well, I won't continue to discuss science. I'll stick with what he's saying about geology. My main problem with that is that he is being very I said the word flowery before, but you get the concept. He's overdoing it a little bit. This might be the only book that people read that mentions stuff like that talks about it. And that's a total misconception or misrepresentation of it. So I just want to take my editing pen and change those words. Okay, I'm done complaining. Not really. Anybody wants to have a private conversation about complaints for this? That's okay. Thank you, Rabbi, for giving me my 15 seconds.
Sure. Other thoughts, comments along the way that stuck out to you or that you were unclear about?
We've talked in this group before about the concept of you can never go home. I mean, that's been a theme in a number of writers' perspective, which I think is just telling you that your family changes, the world changes. It's not exactly the same. You're not really going back to the home that you remember, which then it brings up to me the comparison of the Torah. So the Torah is exactly the same. What's written in the Torah is exactly the same every time we look at it. But our process theology understanding of it is that things do change as you interpret it differently. So you can go back to the Torah. It will be changed in that sense. But, and maybe the Torah is better thought of as your home, as opposed to 4320 Overlook Road in Birmingham, Alabama.
Well, remember, this is going on social media, so you.
Okay.
So I think there's a couple things there. There is the old phrase, "You can't go home," as you described. I think as I was reading that, what popped into my mind was John Bon Jovi. Like John Bon Jovi has a song that came out years ago. I think it's called "Who Says You Can't Go Home," and the whole song is basically him saying, like, there's this phrase, "You can't go home," but he says, like, I've been around the world, and as a matter of fact, there's only one place left I want to go. And he talks about how, as much as you want to get out of your home, as much as you feel like you can't go home, it's still a part of you, and you carry it around with you, and you are who you are because of your home. And so you carry that around, and in some way you always want to get back to that home that you feel like you can't get back to. But you can. It's kind of his argument along the way. Like, check out the song. It's a good song. But I think where Rabbi Artson's trying to go here is a slightly different conversation than Torah. He's trying to pull together one of the conversations we have in Jewish life is, what is the role that Israel should be playing in our lives? He kind of describes that generally there's two poles to this conversation. One pole is Israel is the center of Jewish life. It has always been the center of Jewish life. You read rabbinic texts and they talk about, and he quotes some of it, that The temple and the Temple Mount is the center, and Jerusalem is the highest. Temple Mount's the highest, and then there's Jerusalem, and then there's the land of Israel, and then there's everything else. And in some sense, Israel holds this ideal special place in our heart. And there's a lot of Israeli writers and politicians who will say, we don't really want to hear what the diaspora Jews have to say, because if you really want to know what you really want to feedback, come to Israel and talk to us. And on the flip side, there are people who make the argument that Israel doesn't have to be central to our lives, that you can lead a perfectly wonderful, fruitful Jewish existence outside of the land of Israel. And I think what he's trying to argue is you don't have to have it one way or the other. You don't have to say, I don't want to go to Israel because I can just do as well here. And you don't have to say, Israel's better than everywhere else, and you're wrong if you're not living in the land of Israel. He's saying that Israel can have a special place in our hearts. Israel can be a spiritual home, and you can still live a wonderful, beautiful, fruitful Jewish life not in Israel. And I think ultimately that's the argument he's trying to make is, God is, as much as the rabbis want to say that God is centered in Israel, God, if we are taking the process theology the way he's describing it, God is everywhere. So you don't need to go to Israel to experience God. Although he also argues that there might be some different experiences of God you will get in Israel than you would elsewhere. Comments, thoughts?
Where did the story of the burning bush take place?
Where or when?
Where?
Unclear.
But not necessarily Israel.
Not Israel, and the rabbis have various midrashim on why. One of the more famous ones is God intentionally did not give the Torah to Israel in the land of Israel because God didn't want people to say only the people in Israel can have access to it. God gave it outside of the land of Israel because it should be the ownership of the world and of humanity, not just of the Jewish people. And so God didn't want that limited audience, so to speak, for it.
And that's exactly why I asked about that, because that is an argument against the idea that good Judaism is limited to being in the land of Israel, which it just came up.
There's another great midrash that says that the Torah was given in the desert or in the wilderness because the wilderness belongs to whoever is willing to go out there. So too, the Torah belongs to whoever wants to make the effort to learn it.
My favorite sentence in this whole thing was on page 112 in the sort of middle where it says, for droplets of dew to attain significance, they have to be scattered. I thought it was beautifully stated and I think has a lot of truth in it.
Yeah. So, what's his argument there, Stuart?
Well, I think he's sort of a pro-diaspora person. He really feels like the diaspora has a lot to contribute to Jewish living.
He is living in Los Angeles, so yes, Barbara.
It occurs to me that a very similar argument exists for public schooling versus a Jewish day school. And I guess I'm realizing right now that I've had that conversation with myself, and really it is true that both are necessary, because to make an impact on the community you live in, you kind of have to be part of the public school where people can get to know you and you can have an impact there. And yet to have a strong Jewish community, I think we need to have the learning that the day school allows. So it's very similar to the Israel diaspora idea.
It's interesting. I hadn't thought of it in that way. But to maybe take it another step from what you said, that, you know, it's good for there to be Jews in the public schools, because then, you know, people can get to know Jews and understand them and develop relationships. And those Jews need to have a strong enough Jewish upbringing and Jewish education to be able to be good representatives of the Jewish people in those spaces.
So is that a conundrum, or do we need to find a way to have both happen?
What do you mean?
Well, both is already happening. So I guess it was sort of a reconciliation of why that was okay that both are happening, and why it was maybe even good that both were happening.
So both are happening in the sense that the children that are going to day school eventually come out and go into public school, or that there are some kids that go to public school and some kids that go to day school. That's a question.
I
mean, I would say it was both, and I don't think we can say this is like the Israelis thinking the only way to have a true life is to live in Israel. I mean, I love the day school. My kids went through there, and it meant a lot to our family, but by no means can you say that that's the only way to have a Jewish knowledge. I mean, there are plenty of kids so both. Yes, my kids went on in high school and were in at least in Indian Springs, where they were mixed with other people, and but also there are people that go to elementary school at the public schools and never do go to the day school, and yet have a very full Jewish life and let people get to know Jews. So.
And because we don't have a Jewish high school, the kids have to go somewhere. And yeah, I guess they could go to the Catholic high school. But what's good is this happened to my son, go to the public high school. He went to ASFA and had kids who he was the first Jewish person they ever met. And the reaction was, hey, you're Jewish and you're okay. You're the first, you know, or it was, I can help you with that. You're going to hell, but here, read these 6 papers and it'll help you with that. So, you know, he experienced it both ways, but with his day school background, he knew how to handle that. He was secure enough in what he knew, what he had learned either at home or at school or at Bethel, that he was able to successfully deal with it. But they do end up spending their lives, particularly around here, they do end up spending their lives out in public, away from the day school. So they are mixing, they are interacting.
Yeah, and you know, coming back to the broader conversation, I think there's something very different about living a Jewish life in Israel than there is living a Jewish life in Birmingham. And there's something different about living in a Jewish majority in a place that is steeped in so much Jewish historical significance that just feels different doing it there than it does elsewhere. And that's not, and I think what Rabbi Artson's trying to say is we shouldn't discount that feeling or that emotion. We should embrace that emotion, and there's nothing wrong with feeling that way. And you know, just the mere fact of the history of that land should inspire us in a sense. Yeah, if I had a complaint about this chapter at all, it's he talks he goes into this whole either or notion and says that what we really need is a both and a notion. I think my only complaint is that's kind of where we already are. Like we're not he's not saying, he's not describing a state so much different than we actually already are in. If you look at the population, like the Jewish population of the world, it's something like 48% of Jews live in Israel, and about the same percent live in America. And then the other few percent is scattered throughout the rest of the world. So it's something like 95, somewhere between 95 and 98% of Jews live in either America, like America, Canada, or Israel. In that sense, we already are doing it both and, because that's just kind of the way that the population is structured at the moment. TK, I saw your hand first, but
Yeah, I want to respond to that because I agree with you. We are already there. However, what I read into this when I was reading it was I took this to be a way of also saying, I don't know when he wrote this or what was going on, but today in our current world, there is such tension, both in the Jewish community and the community as a whole, about Israel and about what's happening right now there. And, there's this pull to be on one side or the other side. And it's internal in me. Sometimes I feel this way, sometimes I feel that way. I feel that tension. And so I took these words to say, take a breath. It's okay to have the duality of what's going on now be an internal tension. And that's okay. Not that everything is okay that's happening, but it's okay that you feel torn. And to welcome both support of Israel as a state and perhaps disappointment, fear about what they are the path that they're choosing at the same time.
yeah, and I think to that point, there might be a place where taking this both and, where Israel is not idealized as the center, which allows you to say, I love Israel and I don't always agree with what the government is doing. And I think if we can create a balance a little bit, and then we can also hold that tension of saying, I can love the state and I can love what it represents and I can love what it can be and I can love its potential, and not always agree with every single decision the government makes along the way. And say, that doesn't mean I love it any less. It just means I disagree. It just says, we can love the United States, but we don't have to agree with everything the government does. And that's not even that political of a statement. Cindy?
So, yeah, I do agree that, yes, what we do exist, as you were saying, that, Israel's here, the rest of us, we're other places. But I really think that his message is about acceptance and non-judgment and mutual respect. And, the line that really spoke to me was that we all suffer from those who confuse our own strong convictions with objective truth and who compound that error by conflating their sense of truth with an exclusive claim to it. And of course, I took that, to all other places in our lives in the world today. But in terms of what he's talking about in this chapter is, is that yes, both these different ways of living exist. You may not agree with this, but each are valid. Each are valid. And for these reasons, each are valid. And let's accept each other for that. Because actually, in that acceptance, we are stronger as a people. When we fight, we can disagree, but when we fight as a people, we are weakened. With mutual respect, we have a more, yes, we are all more a part of a whole rather than enemies. And I think that we have enough enemies in this world rather than being enemies of each other.
Nicely said. As part of rabbinical training, we had to spend a year in Israel studying. And I remember I came back and my brother said, what was your biggest takeaway from being in Israel for a year? And I said, Israeli Jews are very different than American Jews. What Israelis think about and worry about and what they're focused on in Jewish life is very, very, very different than what we American Jews focus on. And in some ways, it becomes a very different conversation. Like we're talking around each other in some way because we're not actually addressing the other one's needs or concerns as we're doing so. We as Americans, we often talk to Israelis about, this is what we think you should be doing, but it doesn't actually address what Israelis are thinking. And Israelis look at American life are like, I don't understand this at all. Like, you guys are crazy. Like Israelis look at American Jews are like, why are you doing all these things? Like, why do you need this? Like, just be Jewish. And they look at it like, this doesn't make sense. And so they try to tell us what we should do, but they don't actually understand us either. And, agreed that, we need to be together and united together. And that part of that is we need to learn to talk. We need to talk to address the other person. What the other group. So TK asked for an example. So I'll give you one brief example that comes to my mind is one of my teachers who grew up in America and then made Aliyah to Israel said, he was lying in his bed and his 11-year-old was crawling into his bed every night. And he's like, you're 11 years old. You should be staying in your own bed by this point. You're not a baby anymore. And the child looked at him and said, yeah, but did you have to deal with rocket fire and running to safety rooms when you were 11 years old? He said, get in bed. We kind of intellectually understand. We don't always emotionally understand where Israelis are coming from. There's a reason why a lot of Israelis trend towards Chabad, not because they necessarily agree ideologically, but because it's familiar. It's what Israeli Judaism kind of looks like to them. So they might disagree with this or that, but coming to a conservative synagogue or a Reform synagogue as an Israeli looks wild to them. It's crazy to them. They don't understand why we do what we do and why there's English in the service and why are we singing these tunes and why are men and women sitting together exactly? And there's all sorts of things that we do that they're just like, this doesn't make any sense to me. this conversation is reminding me a little bit of Jonathan Haidt as a book called The Righteous Mind, in which he talks about how we as people actually make decisions and decide what is right and wrong. And his argument is generally, well, there's two arguments. One is that, and this has been proven repeatedly, wish Margaret was here to support it, but we generally make emotional decisions and then we rationalize the decisions afterwards. So generally, we don't actually think through our choices. We kind of instinctually respond emotionally. And then if you were to ask us, we come back with reasons why, but none of it actually ties back into why we made the decision. But the other one is, he says that looking, for example, primarily at Western European cultures, he says, conservatives and liberals make decisions based on different primary values. And his argument is part of the reason why there's such a divide between conservatives and liberals is that we hold different core values that we're making decisions based on. And when we're trying to convince each other, we're trying to convince each other based on the values that we hold dear, not on what the other one holds dear. So I'd have to go pull out the book and look at what the 6 core values are. But, if, to take an example, if liberals are holding freedom of individual choice and freedom of choice and individuality and personal liberty as a core value, while the conservatives are holding loyalty and loyalty as a core value, then us sitting here saying, making the argument about the value of democracy and how we need to each have our own choice, while they're saying, well, we have to be loyal to our country and the people. Well, then you're never going to bridge the divide talking about what your own values are. You need to address the other values along the way. Yes, Barbara.
You're quoting Jonathan Haidt in this, but Rabbi Artson gets into it on page 119 at the bottom of the second full paragraph. He said, humanity's become so polarized that we're no longer capable of sustaining civil conversations because we're unwilling to learn from people that we profoundly disagree with. And it's a foul harvest of an ideology of eternal absolute truth, which is where he drags it back to process theology, that ideas ought to be changed twice or changing also. Yeah,
I think Artson certainly agrees with that principle. I think where Haidt does is he kind of expounds upon what are the things that we are disagreeing about.
It gives the background for it more.
Yes.
Yeah.
He gives the background and the social research. As I say, it's if you're willing to read social science and you're willing to read through descriptions of research studies and statistics, it's a great book. If you don't like that, it's less interesting of a book, because he quotes a number of different studies and results and what the study did and the process they did. If you're into that, it's great. If you're not into that, it gets a little dry.
Rabbi, that's why we have you here, Rabbi, to give us the Cliff Notes version. You can read the book and just tell us.
The book is in my closet. Otherwise, I'd give you better footnotes. But I think that same, I brought all that up to say I think the same principle applies between Israeli and American Jews also. That I think Israeli Jews have a very different set of concerns and values that they're holding on to than American Jews do. And I think both sides keep trying to push our values onto the other without actually having deep conversations about why we're holding the values we are and trying to address each other's values. Yes. Barbara.
It always bothered me in Israel to get the question, and it came up often. Well, why don't you move to Israel? Why don't you live here? And it always, I never really formulated the right answer to that. And so I would cop out, well, because my family's in New Jersey, or something like that. And I didn't really have the right answer, because each time, if this was coming from a taxi driver or someone that I met over a dinner table or something like that, some student at the university, it would always bother me. Why don't you move to Israel? And maybe it's because I hadn't really formed an idea of why I didn't move to Israel. But I also felt, what is their motivation for asking me this? What are they trying to do? And since I never figured that out, I haven't answered that question. Why don't I move to Israel? I'm happy in Alabama at the moment.
Well, we're happy to have you in Alabama.
Thank you.
But look, that's a hard question. Determining somebody else's motivations is always a fraught topic. The rabbis have a saying that only God knows what's in the heart, meaning you can never actually know someone else's motivations or intentions. Only God can really determine that. I think there's a few different motivations somebody may have had, but it depends a little bit where they were coming from along the way. If it was a religious motivation, if it was a political motivation, maybe they just liked you and wished that you were going to move there instead, but it's hard to tell.
I often thought it was economic.
There probably is an economic
Yeah.
motivation as well. It could be an academic one if they knew you were a professor and thought you could bring good scholarship to their universities. That's not impossible either.
Scott was working at the university, not me. I was the housewife.
So we're in Ramadan. Muslims are celebrating Ramadan, and it brought up the question of their dictum that you should go to Mecca. Muslims should go to Mecca at least once in their lifetime, right? But am I correct? There's no mitzvah or commandment in Judaism to go visit or for Barbara to move to Israel, right?
So depends which rabbi you ask. I think there are some who would consider moving to Israel a mitzvah. And when the temple stands, there is a mitzvah of coming to Jerusalem 3 times a year on the major festivals, on Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Without the temple, then the mitzvah is not observable. But there are mitzvot that apply only when you live in the land of Israel also. So, in some sense, if you do live in Israel, then there are mitzvot you can observe that you cannot outside of the land.
Can you give us a couple of examples?
Yeah, so some of them are agricultural, but for example, orlah, the prohibition against eating the fruit of a tree for the first 3 years of its existence, does not apply outside of the land of Israel. It only applies inside. And so, that's if you lived in Israel and decided to plant a tree, all of a sudden you're now observing a mitzvah that you couldn't otherwise. Most of the laws of Shemitah and Jubilee, of letting the land rest in the 7th year, that's only observed in the land of Israel. Those are the first ones that come to mind. I'm sure if I sat down and thought about it, other ones would pop in. TK, was that a hand or you?
Well, it was a sort of thought. Yeah, I'm thinking about what Barbara B was saying about why don't you live in Israel, come to Israel. And it made me flash to a recent trip to Hawaii where we went to the Big Island. And to my surprise, I've never been there before. The Big Island is not as well settled as other islands and other places, or civilized even. I mean, they have some resorts and so forth, but a lot of it is about, living on the land. And we went on one bus tour that took us all over. And I noticed that our guide at least 4 times invited us to come, get a piece of land. Is not, it's not as expensive as people think, and anything grows in this volcanic soil. It was very, come live here. And I realized that they're in a situation, at least on that island, where they actually need population. And so and Israel has kind of historically been in that mindset of we need people, come. Now, I don't know if that's where they are now, but that's the mindset that they've all had for many, many years. So I think that's kind of, where they are. They may get to a point where they go, don't come. We don't need any more people. But I don't know where they are. That would be my feeling of why they say that.
I think it depends where you go in Israel. I think there are some places that are getting a little overpopulated, but I'm sure there are other places where they would love to have more people. So other thoughts, comments?
I agree with.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I agree with Ellen, where she said this was a good chapter, because despite the geology errors, one of the things that I think he really ended up making clear was that people living in the diaspora are no less Jewish, and should, just with his final sentence, live lives of holiness and engagement, Torah and mitzvot, compassion, justice, and beauty. So you could just end the book with that. And maybe he does. I didn't get to the back page yet. But
none of us have. That's the beauty of this.
Yeah. But he makes it valid to live in Los Angeles or live in Birmingham.
And I think ultimately that's kind of what he's trying to argue for, is how can you live a meaningful, like what we need to be doing is leading a meaningful Jewish life, pursuing Torah, mitzvot, relationship with God. We need to be doing that wherever we are, and there's no one place to do it. There are lots of places to do it, and Israel can hold a special place in our hearts as a place to do that without minimizing our ability to do it elsewhere. Just because one place is special does not mean somewhere else is not special.
I also thought that he had a beautiful concept about eternity. I don't know if that was caught anybody else's minds, but he told this beautiful story of his great grandmother's grandfather's tefillin, grandfather's tefillin, and he put it on, and it just, I think, took him across the ages. He could appreciate, he felt like what was stated here was, this is the taste of eternity. It's the moment expressed all of time. Eternity is not the place by itself. It is what we bring to the place, but the land of Israel can open us to the presence of eternity by virtue of our shared and our private experiences there across the ages. Thought that was beautiful.
Even more spectacular if they had been his grandmothers to fill in. In generations ahead, there will be those comments.
Very true.
Yes.
I agree with, if somebody else wanted to talk. Okay. I love the metaphors. I've been teaching metaphors to my creative writing students, and so I was really excited to see both the dewdrop metaphor was beautiful and such an example of how powerful a metaphor can be. And also on page 118 in the last paragraph, when he says the temple has been destroyed, and that immediately put into my mind the metaphor of the Garden of Eden. You know, the fruit has been eaten. We are here. The people have been scattered. We are scattered. It's not an issue. It's not a question anymore. It's about living with that massive, huge, earth-shaking change that has happened, and accepting that it has happened. And now where do we go? And what do we have? And another metaphor I love that he says over and over is, now out of the history, out of understanding and connecting to our history, we can recreate the present and the future. So all of those things. I love the chapter. Okay. That's it.
It does sound like it might be some good notes to end on along. So, kol hakavod, everyone. Thank you for learning together. Next week, we'll get to the section on prayer and how prayer fits into this theology. So that should be, I think we've had some of those questions pop up and come back up over a few times throughout the weeks that we've been learning this book. So it should be a good one to come back to and actually, hopefully, God willing, get some of these questions answered. So thanks for learning together. Thanks for being together, and look forward to learning together next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Be well, everybody. Kol tuv.
Bye, all.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.